they are on. You don't have to worry, Peter. So you already know about the mic.
It's on.
It's on, yes. And you don't have to worry about muting it because they muted it there. So the mics will be on all the time, and then they mute them.
Or someone will unmute it whenever someone's going to turn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Shari and I will share this one, and you guys share that. What's that one?
I think there's 2 minutes, 1 minute.
You guys ready? Very good, welcome. It's great to see so many people here attending a lecture on economics. My name is Jordi Mondria. I'm a professor of economics and the director of the Master of Financial Economics program here at UofT. We're here to have a conversation about this massive global shock that we have in the world economy. And because this is such a big shock, as UofT faculty, we need to have a leading role in talking and discussing these events. As academics at a public university, we need to do better at disseminating knowledge, explaining our research findings. We need to do better at making our work relevant and accessible. Here with us today, we have like a panel of experts. They are all leading scholars in their field, so they are like their areas of specialization are international macroeconomics, international finance, international trade, trade agreements, economic history. They are all at the knowledge frontier, and like little by little, they are trying to push that frontier a bit every day, maybe every year. Before I introduce them, there's some people I want to thank for helping me organizing this event. I want to thank Kate Bagot, Adriano Macedo, Sarah Goddard, Jocelyn Johnston, and Bilal Khan for their help organizing this. I could not have done it without them. I also want to thank the chair of the economics department, Ettore Damiano, for always supporting my, let's say, unconventional ideas. Some of them are good, some others not so good. We're still deciding about this one. Let me introduce the panel. So the first panelist that we have there is Shari Eli. She's an associate professor with a joint appointment in the economics department and the Munk School. She's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the founder and director of the People's History Lab. Her research focuses on economic history, health economics, and demography. Here at the other end, we have Mark Manger. He's a professor of political economy and global affairs at the Munk School and director of the Global Economic Policy Lab. His research focuses on the interaction between international capital flows and domestic political economy. He has studied the determinants of trade agreement formation, and he's the author of the book, Investing in Protection, The Politics of Preferential Trade Agreements Between North and South. Here next to Mark, we have Peter Morrow. He's an associate professor of economics. His recent work looks at how workers were affected in the long run by the Canada-US free trade agreement and how domestic competition influences export performance. He's currently the co-editor of the Canadian Journal of Economics. And next to Shari and Peter, we have Joseph Steinberg. He's an associate professor of economics. His research explores the relationship between trade deficits and manufacturing employment, the consequences of ending free trade in North America, and the effects of trade policy uncertainty. He's an associate editor at the Journal of International Economics. And last but not least, the moderator, Margarida Duarte. She's a macroeconomist whose research focuses on international economics, economic growth and development. Her current work studies structural transformation and the reallocation of resources across broad sectors of the economy. She currently serves as Vice Dean undergraduate at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, which basically makes her like the boss in the room today. She's here to steer the conversation and keeping the rest of the panel in check. Before we begin, I just have like two quick requests, one for the audience and one for the panel. So to the audience, this is the first time that we do something like this, so like go easy on us. We are like learning by doing, and we're improving. We're going to improve in the future. But like if you have feedback, like we'll really appreciate on how to improve these type of events. To the panel, as academics, we like to use jargon. We like to use long answers with lots of nuances and technicalities. Let's try to keep the conversation accessible. We want nuance, right? That's why we're here. But like, let's make it an accessible conversation, as dynamic as possible. So basically, in short, don't make it boring. Margarida, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Jordi. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for this panel. So we are here to talk about the shockwaves to global trade and financial markets that the US administration tariff policy is creating, in large part in response to US trade deficits. So to set the stage for our conversation, let's begin with some fundamentals, and let's just start. What is a tariff? How does it work? Who pays for it? Peter?
Thank you. So the simplest answer is that a tariff is a tax. It is a tax that occurs on a certain type of good, and that good is that's when a good is imported from another country. And like any tax, there's incidence of these taxes. And so what does that mean? So the incidence of the tax says some of it is going to be borne by consumers in the form of higher prices, and some of it will also be borne by sellers of the good in the form of lower prices received if they need to lower their prices, say, to stay competitive. And this is really the crucial question. So the Trump administration, sort of the closest thing to a model that they have in mind seems to be that foreign countries are going to lower their prices by the full amount of the tariff. They will, in effect, pay the tariff themselves, and US consumers won't be affected. But that's not what the evidence says for the most recent set of US-China tariffs. The best evidence that we have right now is that US consumers paid 100% of the tariffs from the trade war 2017-2018.
Okay, great. So thanks. So the policy priority seems to be to address the trade deficits, the US trade deficits. And so the next question that I have on the fundamentals is, what is a trade deficit? And I think, importantly, are trade deficits bad? And then an important aspect of, I think, this conversation is also going to rest on what the financial flows, what the counterpart in terms of financial flows of trade deficits is. And so, Joe?
Thanks, Margarida. So, to put it really simply, a trade deficit describes a situation where a country imports more than it exports. One kind of caveat to that I think is kind of bears mentioning is that a country can have a trade deficit with the entire world, but also perhaps simultaneously both deficits and perhaps surpluses with individual countries. So the United States has a very large trade deficit with the entire world, big trade deficit with China, with Canada, with Mexico, but the US also has trade surpluses with many countries around the world, Australia, Singapore. I think that's kind of important context to keep in mind, and especially, to try to understand or not understand the tariffs that have been put in place so far in terms of trying to correct some of those individual country-specific deficits or surpluses. Anyway, I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind when thinking about trade deficits is what they imply about the flows of capital between countries. So, a country that has a trade deficit, a deficit when we're talking about trade in goods and services with other countries, the way that we use, the kind of accounting principles that we use to keep track of all these international transactions implies that that country has to, at the same time, have something kind of like a trade surplus in assets. In a sense, the country is exporting more assets than it is importing. So the rest of the world is buying assets from that country, and those assets are effectively what are being used to pay for the goods that that country is importing. To get to the question, are trade deficits good? Are they bad? I mean, the short answer is certainly not. Trade deficits are not bad. I think about a trade deficit as just another kind of trade, in a sense. A country can trade with the rest of the world, exchange goods for services. A country can also trade with the rest of the world over time, trade goods today for goods tomorrow. And that's really what a trade deficit is. Is it bad that a country runs a trade deficit? Under some circumstances, I suppose it could be, but in general, the answer is no.
So the US is not subsidizing Canada in the amount of the trade deficit every year. It's just so you would say that's not the case.
I would say that is not the case. No, if anything, in the context of the U.S.-Canada trade balance, in some ways, Canada subsidizes the United States, because the vast majority of the U.S. trade deficit with Canada is comprised of oil imports, and Canada really sells those imports to the U.S. at a discount just by virtue of the kind of the specific geography that we have with one another.
So the U.S. has been running the aggregate deficits yearly since the early 90s. They are, I think, since the Great Recession, at about 3% of GDP every year. And because of this financial flow counterpart, this translates then into an accumulation of net international debt to foreigners. And this may be something that we'll come back to later on, which right now stands at about 70% of GDP. But as you said, the aggregate trade deficit hides, bilateral trade deficits, bilateral trade surpluses. But there seems to be an underlying element in all the conversation and about the current US policy, that the US trade deficits reflect some unfair trade rules. And so my next question is, what do we know about existing trade agreements and the idea that trade deficits, US trade deficits, reflect a global trading system that is inherently unfair? Mark?
Right, thank you. So I think the first part we need to think about is why trade is a good thing and why trade deficits are not necessarily a bad thing. And I think most people tend to come at this from the idea that exports are good and imports are bad. Okay, and of course the problem is, if exports are good and imports are bad, why would you export? Because ultimately you only sell things to other countries so that you can buy things from other countries, right? It's not like you can somehow hoard that money and put it away for whatever purpose, right? Although this was tried, I guess, in the golden age of mercantilism, they could hoard a lot of gold and sit on it, right? Ultimately, that didn't really work so well. The trade agreements are a quid pro quo, where the other side opens their markets for your exports, but you also open your markets for their exports, right? That's what a trade agreement does. That's why it's an agreement. And typically, we face a fundamental problem. That is, if your company is not very good at doing what it is doing, and there's some other company that's incredibly efficient, right? Then if you just take away these tariffs, then your company is probably going to go out of business. So for you, that's terribly important and terribly painful. But for everybody else in this country, it's actually not terribly important, because the benefit from buying all this stuff from somebody else is going to be pretty widely distributed. The cost is pretty concentrated, right? The people who lose their jobs, they feel it right away. The consumer who gets things more affordably, doesn't really care that much, right? So that's a fundamental question. Then why do we even get something like free trade when this is so difficult to do, right? And that's when trade agreements come in. And trade agreements are a way to make this deal where, you know, there's a bit of give and take, and we lower these barriers so that we can export, but also we can buy exports from other countries. Are they inherently biased against the United States? Well, if we just look at goods, we could say that US tariffs on goods are much lower than, say, the Chinese tariffs on goods or many other countries' tariffs on goods. That's probably true, right? But that in itself doesn't make this biased in any way, because the US exports services, all kinds of services, banking, credit card services, Netflix, music, right? All kinds of services, and the barriers to that in other countries are mostly non-existent, and the US is very happy exporting this, right? So they're not inherently biased, these trade agreements, and in fact, what we probably should talk about is not whether they can be somehow, or whether we can somehow return to some kind of mythical time when everything was in paradise and everybody's working in manufacturing or something like that. I don't know why this would be mythical, why this was a paradise for everyone, but more what it is that makes this so problematic, apparently, that we have many people, including people who should know better, saying that free trade is a problem.
So I want to actually say one thing about the aspect of trade agreements relative to free trade in this context, because it's important, I think, to understand that the United States has lots of power. I think sitting here in Canada, we know this. And in some sense, the US does need to cede a little bit of power in these trade agreements. And this is something that people like Robert Lighthizer have talked about. But ultimately, it's supposed to be beneficial in the sense that that's how you get other countries to come to the table. So if other countries were always afraid that the United States was going to tear up all its trade agreements and impose reciprocal tariffs, they would never sign these agreements in the first place. So a lot of these trade agreements, there is some aspect that the US is trying to tie its hands. And I think what's happening now is the US is saying, we don't want to tie our hands anymore, and we're going to assume that you're going to stay at the table.
Yeah, I think this is very important. Trade agreements are supposed to be long-lasting, right? When you decide that this new market has been opened for you, then you're probably going to make investments as a company and say, we are going to produce for this market now. You raise capital, you commit people and capital to this, and you're only doing this because you know that that market is going to stay open for you in the foreseeable future, right? What we're seeing now is that, and this has, typically been the case. I think the US has every once in a while said, hey, wait a minute, there is a problem here and we need to impose some temporary tariffs to, shelter our industry for a little bit and maybe get some concessions from the other side. But by and large, countries have stuck to these trade agreements. What we're seeing now is that we're basically in a situation where we don't know whether it makes any sense to sign a trade agreement because we don't know if this can be ripped up again, right? So the most recent Canada-US trade agreement, right, USMCA, US, Canada, Mexico, is only from Trump's first term. And he has already said that he essentially wants to rip it up. So the question then is, what is the point really of negotiating a trade agreement when the other side is apparently unwilling to see this as a long-term commitment, which is really what it needs to be for the benefits to materialize?
Very good, thank you. So these tariffs are generating a huge level of concern, uncertainty and concern. And so before we dive into the current trade policy debates and concerns, So can you give us an example from history where concerns about tariffs were high and led to substantial economic, political changes, upheaval?
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the mythical manufacturing. So first of all, I should say that as an economic historian, I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would hear President Trump talking about the late 19th century and manufacturing and the McKinley era as being something to return to. So let me, I will say that some of what he says is a little bit true, and some of it is not at all. So let me try and fill this in and hopefully not bore you. So northern manufacturing, so you could think about like a small textile mill somewhere in Massachusetts. These are really small scale operations in the 1860s. There were like 6 to 10 people. Frequently they're family members. And in order to grow these industries in the North, Republicans institute protectionist tariffs. Now, the problem here is that in doing that, they're really hurting the South that is involved in cotton export. So they're supporting one region within the US at the huge expense of another one. And it's not so easy for the South to sort of switch out of cotton, and it takes a long time for northern manufacturing to grow into these kind of sweatshops that we think of when we think about that era. Putting aside that these are very rough jobs that we wouldn't want to return to, something that I think is very interesting is that the region that's hurt, the South, remains hurt for more than 100 years in part because of these tariffs, and that this leads to a lot of animosity between regions in the United States. And so we're thinking, and some of the discussion has already been about how nations respond and kind of inter-nation behavior, feelings. But these kinds of tariffs also create a lot of political turmoil within a country, right? And that's certainly been the US experience. And then there's the issue of like how the revenue from these tariffs actually gets spent, which I'll say something about that later. Okay.
Just a small comment that relates to this, these kind of long simmering tensions between the North and the South. It's just kind of an aside, but something that I think is kind of interesting to observe, and we'll come back to this later when we talk about manufacturing employment in more detail. But when people think about the decline of manufacturing employment in the Rust Belt, many people, I think, in the Trump administration, around the country and around the world, think about those jobs as mostly having flown outside of the country. But in the context of what Shari just said, it's ironic, I think, to recognize that a lot of those jobs actually just moved to the South.
That's right.
There's a lot of manufacturing that has grown up in the South of the United States, in auto manufacturing in particular.
In the 50s, like starting in the 50s.
Yeah, and I think it's just kind of funny to recognize how that has kind of played out historically in light of those tensions that you were talking about.
And there's actually pretty good evidence that the big 3 auto companies were able to maintain market share because of NAFTA, and they were actually able to move some of their employment to Mexico so that they could compete with these southern production lines. So it really becomes much more of a within US sort of conflict than in a cross-country situation.
Yeah, I think we will be talking about manufacturing employment a bit. So the US, the new administration comes in, quickly announces tariffs on Canada, Mexico, then pauses, retreats, there's exemptions, exceptions. Then early April, there is a big announcement of a very large package of reciprocal, country-specific tariffs that was much larger than anything that had been anticipated. Those have also been paused with exemptions for certain sectors and certain products. It's very complicated. So all in all, we went from a situation of an average tariff, trade weighted of 2-3% to now about 25%, and this 25% reflects a tariff of about 10% for most countries and most goods, but again, there's lots of exceptions and exemptions and extremely high tariffs on some Chinese imports, which I think essentially means trade has frozen for those types of imports from China. So this is kind of in a very silly, simplistic way, kind of what the policy has been. And a rationale that has been discussed a lot for the tariff policy in the US is the idea that the sustained trade deficits that the US has been having in goods is a fundamental cause, an important cause behind the decline in US manufacturing. And so the idea that the higher tariffs will bring manufacturing jobs back. And so very simple to start. Can tariffs bring back manufacturing jobs?
I think tariffs can bring back a few manufacturing jobs in specific industries, I'm sure. I'm not going to say zero manufacturing jobs are going to be brought back, but by and large, in the grand scheme of things, the answer is no. And the simple reason for that is that the vast majority of the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States, as well as many countries, including Canada, has nothing to do with trade. It has to do with technological progress. Productivity has grown really rapidly in manufacturing as compared to other sectors. And this goes back many decades, long before the US signed any free trade agreements with Canada or Mexico, long before China joined the WTO. Manufacturing employment in the United States has been steadily declining since 1960 or earlier. So I've actually done some research on this exact topic. What is the contribution of US trade deficits to that decline in manufacturing employment? And the answer is not zero, but it's a pretty small fraction. The answer is somewhere between 10 and 15%. And so eliminating trade deficits, if these tariffs could even do that, which I don't think that they can, is not going to do much in the way of bringing back manufacturing employment to the level where it was many decades ago. On top of that, you have to think about what is kind of the outside option for these manufacturing firms. In the face of these high tariffs, they could bring back manufacturing to the United States, and even suppose they do that, these rapid technological advances that have occurred over the last couple of decades mean that a lot of that production is going to be done automatically. It's going to be done by robots. It's not going to be done by people. So there's also a tension between, to the extent that we can even bring back a lot of manufacturing production to the United States, how many jobs is that really going to be associated with? Not too many. One final thing that I think is kind of useful context to think about this is that, putting tariffs on specific manufactured products can help support, employment and production in those specific industries, but it also really hurts production and employment in industries that use those products that you're putting tariffs on. So a great example of this is if you go back to the first Trump administration when President Trump put tariffs on steel. The evidence says that that did actually bring back a few steel jobs, something about 10,000, a little bit less than that. How many jobs throughout the rest of the manufacturing sector did those steel tariffs destroy? Something like 100,000. So the net effect on the manufacturing sector was, strongly negative, even though there were a few people in specific steel firms that did benefit.
So So in the context of the structural transformation, which is this decline, this trend decline in employment manufacturing, the role of trade is fairly small. But there is another argument, I think, related here that, so in 2000, the level of manufacturing employment fell sharply around the time of the accession of China to the WTO. And I think there's a widespread view that globalization has led to low wage growth for low skilled workers, and that basically globalization is not delivering for a wide fraction of the US population in terms of very broad socioeconomic indicators. And so, so what do we know about the effect of globalization on rising US income inequality and workers' wages?
So if you look at the data about rising inequality, the thing that really jumps out at you is that it's really at the top of the income distribution. So all the influential work by people like Emmanuel Saez, they plot changes in income distribution, and wages, wages are going up, maybe a little flat, but then at the very top of the income distribution, they're just shooting up. And so if you're going to think that trade is really driving this very concentrated change in inequality, it's not obvious how to think about it, because that means it's not whether you have a college degree or whether you don't have a college degree. It's something about, are you a CEO or are you a real estate developer? And then it starts being a little bit harder to come up with stories why trade would have had this very concentrated effect on occupations that you wouldn't normally are really linked to trade, like finance and banking. So trade probably has played some role, but it seems to be more closed economy circumstances such as occupation, the rise of finance, changes in tax policy, that really drive these changes in inequality. And it's also worth noting that these changes in inequality are really concentrated in English-speaking Western countries. You don't see such large changes in France, in Scandinavian countries, and Japan. So even though all these countries have really been subject to globalization, whatever that might mean, there seems to be something very special about sort of this Western North Atlantic set of countries that's driving inequality. And to me, it's not obvious that trade is really driving that.
Just a small thing I want to pick up on as well. The conversation about the effects of trade and globalization on, workers and income inequality, I think it's important to highlight that misses something that's also really important. This conversation always seems to center around jobs and income and wages. But that's not the whole picture, right? The other side of the coin is, that people benefit from being able to buy cheaper stuff from abroad. I mean, there's no denying that. And the evidence, as much as we have, indicates that people at the bottom of the income distribution reap the greatest benefits from those consumption side gains from trade. And this is something I think is just, not highlighted nearly enough in this conversation about kind of the costs and benefits and the distribution of the effects of trade.
All right, this is all very harmonious here. Everybody seems to agree. Wonderful. Let me ask you a question, though, my Misha colleague here. How many people here have seen the TikTok videos that made in China about what it would look like when manufacturing comes back to the US? Overlaid beautiful, beautiful videos, AI generated, chunky Americans slaving away. Yes. So this is of course, that's sort of nice dig at Americans thinking that manufacturing is going to come back. But there's something else here which I think is very important. When we, you can also look at coastal Chinese cities where there's a lot of manufacturing now, where people have become incredibly wealthy, and they have fabulous infrastructure, and they don't seem to have a drug problem or a homelessness problem or any of these things, right? In fact, even when you go to rural China, there's, some wealth seems to be trickling there, right? It takes a long time, clearly, right? But young people have migrated into cities. So when you see these cities, they look really different from what many American cities look like. They look like they're in a different century already. Now, you're saying this has nothing to do with trade. Okay, but clearly they seem to have benefited from trade in a way that other countries have not managed to do. So what is it that the countries that are at the receiving end of these tariffs right now have done right, and why are they benefiting so much from trade?
So I think we have pretty good evidence that countries, originally speaking, there's a huge old literature on export-led development. I mean, it's China, it's Vietnam, it's basically all of Southeast Asia. And there's many cases of countries that really benefit in terms of economic development. China's not the only one. And if I'm understanding the question properly, it's saying, well, how can trade affect those countries but have no effect on the US? And that's a fair question. I think what I was trying to say earlier is that if you're really thinking about the dramatic changes in inequality, it really seems to be factors aside from trade. There have been winners and losers from trade in North America. We know this theoretically since 1941, Stolper Samuelson. Otterdorn and Hansen write about this. But when you actually sit down and you try and drill down as to what are the contributions of these things, it really is these other factors that seem to be driving inequality. It's not that trade doesn't matter at all. It's saying, suppose that you wanted to get rid of this problem, if you thought it was a problem, and you said, I'm going to destroy trade and see if it solves the problem completely. The answer would probably be no. It might change a little bit, but it wouldn't change the entire thing. Now, obviously, then there's a lot of reasons in these other countries why you see dramatic changes. You see movement of labor from agricultural areas into the city. That produces wage gains in some cases. You see increases in capacity utilization, sort of the old capital accumulation, human capital accumulation. And those are also things that are going on in these countries. So it's not just that there are these symmetric countries engaging in trade, and we're seeing things happen. There's a lot of other things going on at the same time, but the point is well taken.
Let me ask a follow-up question. Does it matter if 20 years ago chips were 30 years ago chips were made in the US and now the chips are made in Taiwan and China? Does it matter if China is about to build wide-body passenger planes? All of these things. So does it matter for the wealth of the average American or Canadian if there's another country out there that is climbing the technological ladder, is overtaking us in many ways, right? So electrical vehicles made in China are clearly better than electrical vehicles made anywhere else in the world, right? They've completely leapfrogged over this stage. Does this matter? Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
So that's a great question, and so normally when economists think about trade and trading goods, there's nothing really special about a good. There's guns and butter, textiles and computers. There's nothing really special, and it's not really important to produce one good or the other. And I think that's where a lot of these issues sort of get pushed to the sideline when we teach our basic models of comparative advantage. But in the real world, these things do matter. And the opposite end of it is, say, weapons procurement. You think about who are you going to buy your F-16s from? who are you going to buy your spy technology from? Do you want to buy it domestically? Do you want to buy it from someone you might not be on good terms with? Or you want to buy it from someone you trust? Most prominently yourself. And then in the real world, you start getting this spectrum of goods saying, well, how important is it that I produce this good? And there are some goods where it doesn't matter at all. Perhaps textiles, perhaps furniture. And there's some goods where it matters quite a great deal. In Canada and most countries, telecom is highly restricted in terms of trade because we think it has national security issues. And you really want to think about carefully each of these goods and if there's a well-defined rationale to have it produced at home or to buy it from someplace else. And there's no magic test where you put each good in a bin, but it is sort of a framework for starting to think about it.
I mean, there's a lot of different things I could say about this. I mean, I think, but I'll say maybe two. So the first one is just to echo what Peter said and kind of riff on that a little bit. I think there are certain goods that have clear, what economists call an externality associated with them. There could be a geopolitical externality like Peter was mentioning. There also can be certain products where there are big externalities, associated with research and development. You produce a particular good, a lot of research goes into that, and that, has spillover effects on other industries that are suppliers or downstream of that industries. And that's another reason why you might, be really interested in kind of maintaining production of that industry. But in the absence of those clear rationales that may apply to specific products, no, I really don't think there's a problem. I mean, I think Milton Friedman said something many decades ago in a Newsweek article that I always refer to because he said it really eloquently. In the general principle is if China wants to produce some stuff that is, as you said, increasingly high quality and low price, and they want to give it to the Western world, in exchange for currency, maybe they're subsidizing their firms, so what? That's to our benefit, unless we have very clear rationales for specific industries where that seems to be a particular problem. The second thing I think is really worth mentioning is that, a lot of this, especially in the context of the Trump administration's rationales, comes down to the geopolitical issues, national security issues. Geopolitical risk is not something that just kind of floats out there in the ether, right? It's, to use, Jordi said not to use a technical term, but it's not exogenous, as an economist says, right? Geopolitical risk, in my view, has a big, what we might call endogenous component. It depends on the structure of all the trade relationships that we have around the world. I think there's a lot of evidence that says that deeper economic integration is a great way to forestall and reduce geopolitical risk. We can get rid of some of these geopolitical externalities by trading more with each other. I think that's an important thing to recognize and something that, is the current climate is really kind of going exactly in the opposite direction of that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. The protection of strategically important industries, Trump started doing it with chips, with the CHIPS Act, which now apparently he wants to revise. But that idea would require a tariff regime that is not what is being done. It would be tariffs that...
What Biden did. It'd be what Biden did.
Yes, and tariffs that reflect the complexity of modern production processes, etc. But I want to come back to, I want to talk about, for example, the auto industry. And the trade policy was used to protect the US auto industry in the 80s. And from Japanese cars that were more efficient, lower priced, and how do you see that in terms of, do you see that as so basically it revitalized American production of US autos. So would you see that as a policy success or not a policy success? And again, the idea, again, not what is being done, but is there a case to protect the US auto industry and allow for the US auto industry to catch up to the much more now developed electric vehicle production that is happening in China, from highly subsidized by the Chinese government, the same way that auto production was highly subsidized in the 80s by the Japanese government. So,
so I'll use the I word. It's like industrial policy.
Yes.
It's 2 words, but and there has been this rise of advocating for industrial policy, and even the people who advocate for it most strongly say that it should be justified on one of 3 grounds. Either, as Joe said, that there's an externality, or that there's some sort of coordination failure, sort of a big push argument, or that there is something that the government can provide that no one else can provide. And the simplest version is rule of law. And tariffs are, and you really need to put any argument into one of those 3 bins. So if you think about the auto industry, you need to say, well, there was some externality that existed that would justify protecting the auto industry. Or you would need to say, people aren't buying enough cars, the government needs to step in and make people buy more cars as a coordination issue, or that the government needs to provide some input into cars that the private sector can't provide. And you don't see that. Those aren't the things that you see. And I think, again, it's sort of going back to something I said earlier, I don't think it was sort of the voluntary export restraints from Japan, that really revitalized the US auto industry. I think it was NAFTA. And I think it was really giving the big 3 footing to compete with its southern US competitors rather than its Japanese competitors. There wasn't huge innovation that occurred. This was something where they really broke up the production line in a way that allowed them to be competitive. And it really didn't fall into one of those 3 bins. So I don't think that protection of the US auto industry was a success in that respect.
So, all right, so I tend to agree. And I have been, a happy driver of Mexican cars for the past 20 years. You might be wondering, which Mexican car brand am I driving? Well, obviously the well-known Mexican brand Volkswagen. This maybe is part of the story as well, right? So that Japanese and European manufacturers invested in Mexico in order to serve the American market. And that feels a little bit like the back door to the US market for American manufacturers. Same for Canada, right? There's no real reason to produce cars in Canada, even though, there's human capital, all the wonderful things, unless you can export to the US market, right? So I think it's important that while there is a clear benefit for American manufacturers, there was also a benefit for Japanese and European manufacturers to essentially be able to, produce in Mexico and Canada to serve the U.S. market. But there are, I can think of 3 instances where tariffs and trade policy made a real difference for the industry. One is the Korean auto industry, right? You still will not see many foreign cars in Korea. And it used to be that, if you drove a German car, the tax inspectors would come. And, sort of first generation Korean cars looked eerily like European models. Now they look a bit more like Japanese models. But by now, Korean cars are everywhere, right? So they must have done something in terms of using this protection of the domestic market to then get them to export subsequently. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily a good or a bad thing, because it also means that we have more affordable, better cars here, right? So that's one way where I think maybe industrial policy and tariffs can interact. A different one is where, why do we drive SUVs here and pickup trucks, right? We drive SUVs and pickup trucks in North America because at some point, the Europeans said, we don't want your chlorinated chicken. And in response to that, the Americans said, well, that's fine, then we don't want your cars. So we're going to put a tariff on light-duty vehicles. And the American manufacturers said, well, that's great, nobody's going to compete on this, right? And European manufacturers don't really build pickup trucks, but Japanese manufacturers were like, you want pickup trucks? We'll give you pickup trucks, right? And they started building pickup trucks, right? So the Toyota Tacoma pickup truck is built somewhere in the south of the US, right? So that was clearly that benefited US manufacturers, right? This was protectionism that benefited US manufacturers, right? Okay, so these are sort of examples from the auto industry, but let me give you an example of what Peter mentioned, which is an industry where you might want to have it, and where protectionism made a difference. So that is shipbuilding. So the US does not really build ships, except warships. And when you look at who builds commercial cargo ships and churns them out at a stunning rate, it's by and large China and then a little bit South Korea, right? So could an argument be made that this is actually somehow important for the US to be able to produce ships, because you never know if there's going to be some kind of future scenario where the Chinese say, well, no, sorry, you cannot use our ships. Should the US have a manufacturing capacity for these things like that? And are tariffs the way to go about that?
I will add that the Jones Act was actually originally, so the Jones Act, I'm going to mess up the institutional details, but if you're going between two US ports, it has to be on a US built and US operated ship. And this is a major problem for getting things shipped to Puerto Rico, for example. And it was originally implemented to help the US shipbuilding industry. And clearly it hasn't helped because China has lapped the US multiple times on this. So, whether or not these policies are justified, there is the question of, will the incentives actually line up? And you need to think really hard about this and whether it will work. And, Korean case, it worked. Jones Act case, it didn't work. And there's good works being done in trying to figure out why it works in some cases and not in others.
Okay, I want to ask about other industries that you might want to protect from the point of view of something like national pride or pride of work. So, like, if we think about the Great Depression or even throughout the whole of the 20th century, when you look at like people who've become unemployed or need welfare assistance, the take-up rate of these kind of social programs is like around 50%. So a lot of people, and there's great narrative and evidence and data, there's a lot of evidence that people just want a job, and not only that, they feel that their sense of identity is bound up in a specific kind of job that they're trained for. So like people in the auto sector in Michigan, like, at least in the 90s, we used to hear a lot about this. So at what point do you support an industry in order to sort of prevent these feelings of demoralization, right? And kind of not go down that path that we think leads to all kind of social ills.
So that's
Is that an externality?
I pass on that. asking if it's externality. But I will say, I think this is, when we think about the as we call them, the gains from trade, we often imagine that there are these magic transfer payments moving around the country where the winners compensate the losers so that everyone's better off. And in reality, especially in the US, those don't hold. Yeah. And I think, and David Otter has sort of written about this in the sense of, we really, I think as a global society, need to think about how do we compensate the losers from globalization. In some countries, they're just said, okay, in the name of progress, you're on your own. And I think we do need to think seriously about what happens to these people and how can they be compensated, and not just monetarily, but in terms of dignity. so that there really can be this sort of, now I will use the word mythical situation where everyone gains from trade.
I think, to speak directly to your question about is this an externality, I mean, I think there probably is some evidence that it is, to the extent that, the situation that prevails in Rust Belt cities is linked to, the opioid epidemic and things like that. I mean, if that link is there, I'd say that's an externality. I guess I'll push back on the question, though. I mean, Peter is right in that we probably, we need to think seriously about how to perhaps better structure a system of redistributing some of the gains to, at least, financially keep the losers from trade afloat to a greater extent than we have. But I also kind of push back on that in the sense that, I don't feel like trade is special. And this comes back to what I was saying about technological progress. There are, to the extent that people have been pushed out of certain industries by trade, a far greater number of people have been pushed out of jobs through technological progress and other kinds of policy changes that are unrelated to trade. And we don't really talk about that. We don't really, I mean, maybe we do, but we don't talk about that in the same way that we talk about the losses from international trade. And now I bet I know where you're going to go, so I'm going to let you go.
Where do you think I'm going to go?
A ways back in history?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
I wasn't, no. Actually,
No, I thought I was
once.
actually going to go to the Luddites. I was going to say, many years ago, we did actually think a lot about that. But anyway, maybe we can have a back and forth.
No, I mean, I think the issue here is that tariffs do raise some revenue, not enough to get rid of the income tax, but they do raise some. And so then the question, maybe that's a little bit how it's different, is where does that money go? I'm sorry, I stole your question, your next question.
It's totally fine. So that is, I think now.
Yeah, that is a fair question, and that is something that is different about tariffs, or I guess I'll say, I guess the reason it's not the way that I think about it is that, historically we have not had tariffs on a lot of things. We're talking about free trade is responsible for job losses in certain places and industries. How's that really, I guess my point was, how's that any different than something else that's not associated with trade and also doesn't really generate any revenue? If we're talking about tariff revenue, I mean, that's kind of going the other way. What we're doing is going away from free trade and in the process generating some revenue. And I think there is an important conversation to be had about what we ought to do with that revenue. Should we use it to, lower income taxes and those kinds of things? But to the extent that we're going to put tariffs on certain products to protect jobs in in certain industries, I don't think we should be using the tariff revenue that comes along with that to also even further support those industries. I'm not sure that there's a case for that.
Should I go to the history? Okay, so historically, what was the tariff revenue used for? So in the late 19th and early 20th century, all of this revenue that was generated from these protectionist tariffs to protect northern industries was actually used to provide veteran pensions for those who served on the side of the North during the Civil War. And the reason that that's kind of important is because these pensions weren't just given out for service. They were given out, they ate up 40% of the federal budget, and they were given out exactly during election, like right in October and November before important elections in swing states. And if you look at the data, you could see that men who lived in these areas wind up getting really high increases or a pension for the first time as a way of vote buying. And this is what really secured Republicans, who were actually embarrassed by this very large surplus that came from tariffs. This is what secured their position in the White House and in control of Congress for nearly all of, from the period at the end of the Civil War, all the way almost to World War I, right? And so I kind of bring this up because I wonder when I hear President Trump talk, I wonder where is this money going to go? So there's this idea that we'll get rid of the income tax, and then that we'll use revenue there, but we will not likely generate enough, right? Yeah.
I mean, certainly you can't generate. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is, of course, you know, the idea that you can replace income tax with tariff revenue, of course, runs into the problem that if the tariffs are really effective, then you don't import very much, so you don't have a lot of tariff revenue. There's nothing to replace. Or if they are not that effective and people still import stuff, then somebody is paying the tariff as a tax, as Peter mentioned initially, right? And those are probably not the people who get this big income tax relief, right? So that's inherently problematic, right? It's inherently problematic. I will say, though, that I think one of the bigger differences between trade and other changes, like technological changes, is that when it comes to trade, we're talking about people somewhere else in some other country, right? People fight technological change all the time, right? Just not very effectively. Like, imagine somebody invented a technology that would help students write take-home exams. You know, professors would be up in arms, right? But there's nothing you can do about it, right? The technology is out there. You can't put the genie back into the bottle. But it also doesn't happen to other people, right? Somewhere else in the world, right? So I think when we need to keep in mind that there is this political element in tariffs, which is we're protecting our industry, right? Protecting our industry, our people. We can somehow keep the world out, and it's other countries stealing our jobs. That's probably, I mean, wrong as this may be, but this is how the perception is different from technological change that affects us and affects people elsewhere in the world.
So I'll add on to that. We actually have pretty good survey evidence that people, when presented with a shock that has nothing to do with trade, say a technology shock, and they're given a menu of options for how should we attack this shock, trade policy pops up. So people will say, you know, there's demand falls in an industry, impose tariffs. Automation gets rid of jobs, impose tariffs. So there really is this sense in which people view the other as sort of being a scapegoat for problems, and I think this is a really important point.
Okay, thanks. There was a great discussion. So you're talking about the use of tariffs and the loss of manufacturing and how it's driven by this idea to protect manufacturing. And this bears some similarities with a declining agricultural sector in the early 20th century and a drive to impose tariffs to protect the declining agricultural sector. And so what happened then, and what are the lessons from this episode, which I think is also important for a broader understanding of tariffs and their effects?
So I think you're talking about the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So during the Great Depression, so in 1930, the Hoover administration enacts tariffs to try and support farmers and manufacturers. There's been some discussion in the news about how we should think about that, how it's similar in some respects to what's happening today. There, I actually think perhaps we might put less emphasis on it because things were quite different. So first of all, in this period, imports and exports are not a very dramatic driver of the decline in GDP, right? It's the collapse of spending on consumer durables that becomes much more important. This is also a period in which you have tremendous uncertainty. So on how the depression is going to unfold, when it will end. But I think what is pertinent is that this act that's meant to help farmers actually results in this incredible trade war, right? And I think that's the place in which it's similar today. And I think the sort of what the lesson is there is this need for international cooperation between countries and trade agreements that bring in many countries together at the same time. And there's not so much a lesson about getting out of recessions or the Depression or whether it works. It was a huge policy blunder. It didn't help, but it wasn't the reason why the Great Depression lasted as long as it did either. It just sort of really spoke to the need for more cooperation.
I have a question for Joe. It's inspired what Shari just said. So the 1930s, right, were also characterized by a period of competitive devaluation of currencies, right? So countries that used to be on the gold standard, and some countries sort of stupidly stuck to the gold standards, but other countries went off this gold standard and decided to devalue in order to protect their own industries. So how does this work? Well, very simply, right? If your currency is weaker, then your exports are cheaper and importing anything becomes more expensive. So it's kind of like a blanket tariff. It used to be, until very recently, and even under during Trump's first administration, that there was this charge levied against China and other partners that, oh, they're currency manipulators and we need to do something about this. Now, there's less talk about that now. But from an economic point of view, is this actually manipulation and is it a problem? And who pays for this? Does the US pay when China devalues its currency or keeps it undervalued?
I mean, in my view, the answer is no. On the face of it, when China undervalues its currency, how does it do that? It does that by, and this comes back to what I was saying, towards the beginning of the discussion about the flip side of trade deficits being, financial surpluses in some sense. China's doing this by buying US assets, right? And obviously it's getting the money to buy those US assets. It's not just somehow stealing that money from the US to buy those assets. That money that China is raising to buy those assets, to accumulate these reserves, as we sometimes call it, that's money that's coming from the Chinese domestic economy. At the end of the day, that's Chinese consumers that are paying for that. It's not the Americans. The Americans are getting, again, as I said earlier, they're getting cheaper stuff as a byproduct of that devaluation, but it's not clear to me why that's bad. I see that as a subsidy at the end of the day that is being paid for by Chinese consumers, and American consumers reap the benefits of that. The only way I see that you can go outside of that framework and think about the harms coming about this, it has to go back to the discussion that we were having before about specific reasons that, substituting away from, some domestic products towards imported products is bad. It has to be an externality. It has to be some kind of national security concern. But in general, cheaper textiles, I think this is, Americans are reaping the benefits of those cheaper textiles that perhaps Chinese consumers are at the end of the day paying for by, financing the buying of these reserves that the Chinese government is doing. I mean, that's my perspective on it.
As a follow-up, so is it a good or a bad thing if the US dollar is strong for America? Because somehow strong dollar sounds much more powerful than weak dollar, cheap dollar, right? But at the same time, if we just agreed that this is probably not the case, but if someone believes that, China undervaluing its currency is somehow fleecing the US, then the response should be, well, then the US dollar has to be much weaker. Does this matter?
I mean, again, a strong dollar allows U.S. consumers to buy stuff from other countries aside from China more cheaply as well. I see that again as a benefit. What a strong dollar does is, I think, the proponents of, trying to fight back against currency manipulation, what a strong dollar does do on the downside potentially is make it harder for U.S. firms to compete on the export market. And coming back to the, kind of relating the current moment to what Shari was saying about, the Great Depression era, that was probably more true then to some degree. And the reason for that is that, during the 1930s, the vast majority of international trade consisted of, what we call final goods, things that are directly consumed. But that's not true today. More than half of international trade today consists of intermediate inputs. And so the situation gets a lot more complicated when we talk about, relative valuations of currencies in terms of how they affect the competitiveness of, say, American firms in the international market. Yes, having a strong dollar makes, if you don't think about anything else, it makes the prices of those products, higher and perhaps makes them less competitive. But at the same time, it makes it a lot cheaper for US manufacturers to buy stuff from abroad and turn that into finished products. And so the effects on competitiveness are not at all obvious, I would say.
Okay, so I think maybe we will talk a little bit more about the broader global financial implications. I think it would be also nice to talk a little bit about the effects of the trade policy, a lot of uncertainty, economic effects of policy uncertainty and trade policy uncertainty in particular, and then also, and maybe focus a little bit more on Canada and response, and I guess also following up on what Shari just said. What should countries do? Retaliate? What other types of responses? I don't know, Joe or.
Yeah, I don't know which of those two topics we want to hit on first. I think it might, from my perspective, it might make sense to talk about the second component first, about, what should countries like Canada do in response to this stuff, and then maybe move to the discussion about, policy uncertainty, because I kind of see that as the longer term implication of all of this stuff, even if these, the current round of tariffs gets undone. I think, that's, kind of a good way to perhaps end the conversation. So I'll start with the retaliation stuff. And I've been harping on this out there for months now, and nobody here in Canada seems to want to hear it. But my perspective is that retaliation is fruitless. As Peter said at the beginning of the conversation, a tariff is a tax. The Canadian government is going down into the United States and paying for billboards, saying that tariffs are a tax on American consumers, and they're absolutely right when they say that. But that logic has to be turned around. Our retaliatory tariffs are taxes on Canadian consumers too. There's no way around that. They're harmful. And they're even more harmful potentially for our economy, although, currently those tariffs that we've put in place in retaliation are fairly narrow. But to the extent that the Canadian economy buys a whole lot more stuff from the US than vice versa, retaliating is even more harmful for us. And I'll just say, before Shari chimes in, it's not just about making stuff more expensive. It's not just about a tax. It also limits the number of, the products that are available for us to buy entirely. There's a great example from last week. Mazda announced that they were going to halt production of the CX-50 SUV, which is a great, it's a really popular new car. It's one of their, I think, best reviewed models. They're going to stop producing it entirely for the Canadian market. Stock that Mazda dealerships have, once it's gone, it's gone. You can't buy that car here anymore. And it's because of the retaliatory tariffs. They're still producing that car at their Alabama factory for the US market, but they're not going to produce it for the Canadian market. We can't buy that here anymore. And this is a cost that Canadian consumers are paying already.
I was just going to say, and this is not rooted in my training in economics, it's just that I think we're just back to pride. There's just national pride has a value.
So I agree that it doesn't make sense to put a tariff to retaliate, especially, because it only hurts Canadian consumers, and it would have to be pretty specific. If you could figure out it's this senator or this member of Congress, and it's that firm that's really hurt by the tariff, and people always say bourbon. No bourbon on the shelves of the LCBO. That's really going to hurt the Americans. I'm not really seeing much of an effect. Right? Because I don't think anybody has sort of Trump's ear in a way that this would matter. But here's a question. What about our own exports? could we put a 25% tariff on exports of potash, oil, all the things that the Americans are buying from us? And would that be a way, I mean, not saying we should do it, but would this be a way to have leverage in trade negotiations? And wouldn't then logically American consumers pay for that, at least until they find some kind of alternative suppliers, which may be hard for, heavy crude from Canada, and maybe hard for potash, because the only other one out there is sort of Russia and Ukraine, and they're sort of busy not trading that much.
So you've hit on exactly the strategy that the well-trained and classically respected economist Doug Ford hit on a couple months ago. He said we're going to impose he didn't call it an export tax, he called it a surcharge. But he said we're going to impose a surcharge on Ontario electricity to the Northeast, and the next day Howard Lutnick got on the phone with him. And, that's all we know. So there is an argument for an export tax on energy exports, on potash. Basically anything that is demanded inelastically. There is an argument for an optimal export tax. I actually find it somewhat surprising that we haven't heard that more in the conversation. I want to chime in on this, is retaliation good or bad conversation, because I have a lot of cognitive dissonance about this. And in principle, I agree with Joe that you're just punching yourself in the head by imposing retaliatory tariffs. And I would also add that you also give the other country an easy off-ramp if you don't retaliate. You don't get caught in this prisoner's dilemma game if you don't retaliate. You just say, the other country can say, you know what, I don't want to do it, and we're going to go back. Bygones be bygones. But there was a nice tweet. The thing that caused me to rethink it a little bit was there was a tweet by Olivier Blanchard, who was the former chief economist of the IMF, I believe. And he said, very, very briefly and very quickly, he said, well, if you think it's going to change the other person's mind, maybe. If you don't think it's going to change the other person's mind, no. And I thought that was a good way of doing it. And I think this gets into what Mark was saying about these very targeted tariffs. Bourbon was because Mitch McConnell was senator from Kentucky. There were China imposed retaliatory tariffs on Harley Davidsons, Levi's jeans, and bourbon. You might say, well, why those goods? Paul Ryan was from Wisconsin, Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco, and Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. So there was this sense that they were going to China in the first trade war was going to try and target these places where there was someone who had the administration's ear, and where there was some rationale that they might be able to change their mind. Now, this is why, economists are not good at politics, because we don't understand how these machinations work, but there is a chance that could be a rational idea. So this is why I'm sort of a little bit more on the fence about retaliatory tariffs. If they can be well targeted at very politically sensitive places, there is some evidence that it can work. But again, only if you think that it's going to change the person's mind. If it's not going to change the person's mind, I'm back in classical world where you're just punching yourself in the head.
Yeah, I mean, the comment is well taken, but it really does hinge on, is this going to change the Trump administration, in this case's mind? And so far I think the evidence is no. It is instructive, I think, to look at how Mexico and Canada have been treated by the Trump administration so far. Mexico has not retaliated in any way. I think, way back in February, when President Trump first started raising the idea of 25% tariffs, President Sheinbaum mentioned something about retaliation, but it was never put into place. And she hasn't really done anything in retaliation throughout this whole process so far. As of now, Canada, China, the EU are really the only places that have retaliated in any measure, but Canada and China really are the countries that have put in place the biggest retaliatory packages so far. Has Canada been treated any differently than Mexico? I think the answer is no at this point. So I don't really see how so far the retaliatory measures we've put in place have done much. And I think to go back to the export surcharge, theoretically you're absolutely right, but again, you have to go, is it going to change somebody's mind, or is it actually going to make them do even more, right? And I think when Doug Ford started talking about putting a tax on electricity that crosses the border, I mean, there was a very strong reaction by President Trump and Secretary Lutnick saying, look, if you do this, we're gonna go all in and we're gonna just be even harsher on you. And so that is the other side of that. Retaliation isn't necessarily going to cause the other side to back down. It can cause them to do even more damage. And in Canada's case, given how exposed we are to the U.S. economy, that I think that concern is pretty important.
So the other aspect on the consequences was about trade policy uncertainty and more medium long-term effects. And so maybe we could now talk about that. And I think, well, you are also an expert on that. And so let's start with you, Joe.
Yeah, sure. So there's, again, this is an area where I could go on for the whole time we have allotted on this topic. But, let me just start with the basics in terms of why it matters. So there's a lot of evidence that policy uncertainty, but particularly trade policy uncertainty, has adverse effects all across the economy on investment, on hiring, on innovation. What is the key thread that links a lot of these decisions? It's that they're forward-looking. The future matters a lot. Firms care about the future, what the future is going to look like when they make these decisions. And the big complication really is that they have to pay the costs up front. You want to build a factory. I mean, President Trump is trying to get car manufacturers to build new factories in the US, right? You got to pay those costs up front. But the returns to that investment don't accrue until many years in the future. And so what you care about is what the state of trade policy is going to look like 2, 5, 10, 20 years down the line. And so, when there's more uncertainty about what that looks like, all the evidence says that firms pull back on making these kinds of decisions and go into wait-and-see mode. In economics, it's what we call a real option. You kind of wait until situation changes, you learn some new information before going in and making these decisions, one way or another. And so, to go to the current the current context, I mean, yes, President Trump has raised tariffs a lot. But, in a way, what he's done even more is raise uncertainty about what the future of trade policy looks like. And this comes back to what Mark was saying as well about, are free trade agreements, are they credible? Do we have any expectation that they're going to last? I mean, when NAFTA was formed, the expectation was that this is going to be something that is going to last forever. President Trump has, signed on to the USMCA not that long ago. That's already been torn up. And so, the future of what policy looks like is just much more up in the air. And I think really, to the extent that, I'm hopeful that maybe these tariffs will get undone, maybe some of the court challenges will succeed or something like that. But even if that happens, if a year from now, the tariffs that President Trump has put in place on Canada, Mexico, China, all around the world, if they're fully taken off, we're not back to square one. We're not back to the pre-Trump status quo. The amount of uncertainty about what the future looks like is still going to be massive. And so I see that as being, in the medium to long term, really the big issue that the global economy is going to have to tackle. This is going to be a drag on economic growth for the long term. And I think that's, if there's something that keeps me up at night about this stuff more than anything, it's that.
I'm interested in sort of a specific aspect of that. So, one thing we've seen once these tariffs were imposed, or at least once the talks started and then they were imposed and they were taken down and it became very uncertain, was that there were sort of gyrations in the market for U.S. Treasury bills. How does that work, and what is the key role really of these in the global economic system, global financial system, and then why were people worried about that? Is it just a bunch of hedge funds now needing to be bailed out possibly, which is not going to happen, or is there really some other function?
I mean, I don't have the evidence on exactly who was buying and selling these things, but to give you the big picture, I mean, one of the things that's actually really interesting about this situation is the simultaneous depreciation of the US dollar that we've seen since April 2nd, coupled with that increase in interest rates on US government bonds. That kind of divergence doesn't happen often. What happened, I think what people were expecting to happen, and what was happening throughout February and March, was an increase in the value of the US dollar, say, especially against the Canadian dollar and against the Mexican peso, because that's what standard theory says should happen. US puts tariffs on products from these countries, those products become more expensive, prices in the US go up, demand for currency changes in a way that makes US dollars more expensive. This is what people expected to have happen. That has not happened now. And so the worry I think that you're getting to is that people see a possibility that an important kind of pillar of the global economy might be changing, which is the kind of dominance of the US dollar and the US financial system at, kind of the center of, the global trade order. And, it's hard to say whether these trends how much of these trends are driven by that, but I think, a lot of this does relate to the conversation about, what does the greater uncertainty about what the future really does look like. I think it's, it's undeniable that some of this is people looking at the situation and saying, look, the US itself looks a lot more uncertain. It looks more uncertain both in terms of its trade policy, but in terms of its overall political system. There's concerns about the sustainability, growing concerns about the sustainability of US government spending as well, and I think no expectation that the Trump administration is going to get a handle on that. And so it does seem like there's, to some extent, global investors are shying away from the US. I mean, I think I saw a striking statistic a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I don't remember how long ago it was, but when bond yields in the US started going up, the yield on Greek government debt was actually lower than the yield on US government debt. It was not that long ago that Greece went through a sovereign default, and interest rates on Greek debt were almost 20% because the Greek government was this, totally, unreputable borrower. And now all of a sudden it's viewed as a safer investment than the US government. That's kind of crazy. And to some degree that has to be what's going on.
Okay, Peter, but then we will turn to, briefly, we'll turn to questions and answers.
I'll try and make it an interesting question, and I'll ask you, Margarida and Joe, to put on your and anyone else to put on their prognosticator's hat. What would it take for there to be even a slow moving, but a run on the US dollar?
Towards what? Which currency?
So there's no state of the world where that happens.
No, I think a big question is what currency could replace the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. There are issues with the euro and the architecture of the European Monetary Union that I think can raise some issues. And then what the yuan are really world investors going to start investing. So I think an adjustment is quite possible. I think we are seeing a lot of potential realignment in global financial markets, but I don't think it's clear who can take the role. I don't think that's clear to me at all. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think about this as well. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of people talking now about, is this, the American century over? Are we now in the Chinese century? Given kind of what Mark was saying earlier about, the rapid technological progress in China, how good they are getting at producing, all different kinds of things. Some people look at this and say it's just kind of inevitable that China is going to be the new world leader. Maybe, but again, as you said, I mean, can the Chinese currency replace the US dollar as the kind of linchpin of the global trade order and global financial system? I mean, it's just impossible unless China abandons and really has to completely abandon its capital control policy, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. And so the question really is, I mean, what else is there? It's really not obvious. I don't have a good answer for that either.
So that was an interesting question with a almost non-answer, but and so I think this is now a good time to maybe turn to questions from the audience. So we'll.
I'll start here. Hi, thank you for the great talk. I was going to ask, now knowing that tariffs are not exactly the best retaliatory method to get maybe countries to change behavior, in situations where trade barriers or non-tariff barriers or even tariff barriers are imposed on a country, maybe not even specifically in the case of the United States, just generally, what tend to be the policy actions that do end up yielding a better return in terms of those barriers being removed?
So a lot of US trade agreements to end up being a trade-off between market access and intellectual property protection. So you'll see that the US will grant a country market access in exchange for that country promising to enforce copyrights on things. Or sometimes it's geopolitical. You say, we're going to let there be some military bases in the country, but you always, I think if you're going to be a policymaker, you want to put on your creative hat and say, what is this thing that I possess that another country might be interested in? And given the US's reliance on service exports, that's usually, including intellectual property, that's usually a good place to start looking.
Let me just add on to that very briefly to give some more specifics to the situation with Canada. I mean, the US has repeatedly asked Canada to drop its digital services tax. This has been a sticking point not only for the current Trump administration, but throughout the Biden administration as well. This is very obviously something that the United States would like to see go away. This is something that the Canadian government absolutely could do tomorrow if they wanted to. And it's something that I've been absolutely advocating for.
I've got a question that leads eventually to policy implications around retaliatory tariffs. But to get there, I was looking for this MBR paper recently, which motivates this question, and around how the US is a different kind of country when it comes to imposing tariffs because of its large size. And so there's this terms of trade benefit that we would never kind of consider for Canada because we're small, but the US is a big buyer, and so it can move its weight around. And you're probably familiar with the paper that finds that there's unilaterally, the US can get some terms of trade benefits that, maybe make it welfare positive to have some tariffs, and that it's retaliation that makes welfare negative. And so in that context, Canada is one small country in this global, but it's a global tariff shock. And so maybe it's the coordination of Canada with other countries that actually causes some economic discomfort for the US, that we can't think of Canadian retaliatory tariffs in isolation, but rather as part of a global response that causes maybe some pushback.
This is the entire point of the WTO. I mean, the entire point of the WTO or GATT beforehand was to have it not be the situation where there was a big economic power negotiating individually with a bunch of small countries. Rather, there was everyone coming together in a big multilateral round with most favored nation tariffs being applied equally across all countries. So there is an argument for that, and it's an argument that, and it's an institution that's existed since 1947. And I can't believe we've gone the entire conversation without using the words GATT or WTO. But, oh, sorry, I apologize. I apologize. But there could be some, geopolitical machinations flying across the Atlantic, or we can just go back to a big multilateral setting.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much for the talk. Really fascinating insights, so much to think about. Oh, hi, everyone. In an effort to, I think, bring it all together, I am super curious, and I know in a way you've kind of answered this question throughout the discussion, but just to tie it all together, we obviously have a new government. I'm wondering if, any of you, all of you could, leave a 1 or 2 minute voice note that Mr. Carney would listen to when he walked into the office tomorrow morning. What would you tell him?
I'll go last.
Go over your notes from grad school.
It's a tough one. I think, again, number one, retaliation is fruitless. Don't do it. Number two, use this as an opportunity to do hard stuff that is impossible during normal political circumstances. There's a whole lot of low-hanging fruit in Canada in terms of policies that we could change to make our economy more dynamic, function better, grow faster. For a wide variety of reasons, these things are difficult to do, have been difficult to do during normal times. This is a unique opportunity. Leverage this crisis, do hard stuff.
Yeah, I second that, and I will just add that Canadian productivity growth has been lagging behind US labor productivity growth since the early 80s and other G7 countries. So there is a very deep productivity growth problem in Canada, and that requires action, maybe difficult policies, and this is a unique this is an opportunity to set a stage for policies that can lead to productivity growth. Yes.
Yes, riffing off, sorry, just want to riff off Margarita's comment for a second. I think one of the things that's important is related to that is that I think Canada should resist the temptation to go inward-looking autarkic nationalism. You always see people saying, boycott US, buy Canadian. There's a third path. There's lots of other countries out there. They should be engaging with other countries so that this isn't sort of this false dichotomy.
All right, so as a political economist, I don't subscribe to the great man theory of trade policy or other policy. I actually think it matters who elects these people. And so I'm 100% certain this advice is not going to be appreciated or listened to for this very reason. But let's assume for a moment this was different, okay? There are a number of specific issues that this country could do. Our trade agreements with other countries other than the US are always hamstrung by the same domestic groups that are being protected. So Joe mentioned telecommunications a while ago. I don't think there's a strong national security argument for having Bell, Rogers, and Telus run this. So the sky has not fallen in the European Union when they liberalized telecommunications, right? And even the Americans have their telecommunications run by T-Mobile, which is a German company, right? Part of that, telecommunications. So I think that's one that could easily be opened. Dairy supply management, the third rail of Canadian politics. So for those who don't know this, there are 12 ridings in Quebec and Ontario, the vast majority of them conservative, and that's where Canadian dairy farmers are absolutely crucially important to win those ridings. Nobody ever wants to touch this. Nobody ever wants to touch this. It'd be very easy to improve on the Canada-EU trade agreement if we were to open our dairy market and the sky again would not fall. Australia did this. They started with supply management, very similar to Canada, and they have abolished it with over a long process of paying people off. But we don't need this, right? We can do this now. Is this politically possible? Forget it. Not even, I mean, with a minority government, no, there's no way. But it would be a good idea.
I think I would just express gratitude that we have a prime minister that understands everything that we just spoke about quite deeply and has training in it. And so yeah, I want to express gratitude, and if you see this, come join us. We'll do this again, and you will put one more chair.
So there's actually research in political science that shows that countries elect economists when they're in a crisis situation. Especially countries that have serious economic crises tend to elect economists, PhD-trained economists. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that this increases economic growth or changes anything to the better.
I still express gratitude.
So I have a question that was teed up nicely by your most recent answers. So as all of you know, one of the greatest regularities in trade flows is that geographic proximity predicts large trade flows, which is a real problem for Canada and Mexico right now. And so my question is, thinking about the medium to long-term equilibrium for Canada specifically, and whether this is due to ongoing tariffs from the US or the increased uncertainty that Joe was mentioning, what would you predict, or what do you think Canada ought to aim for as a new equilibrium, whether that's increased trade with like-minded countries like Europe, or increased autarky, or other alternatives? What do you think the medium to long-term equilibrium should trend towards, or will trend towards?
So, just to put a point on it, I don't think Canada can just go off and sign trade agreements with lots of other countries. You see this point being tossed about. Canada already has trade agreements with everyone already, so we can't sign any new trade agreements. We can try and deepen things with additional concessions and concessions on the other side. But Canada is sort of hamstrung. I think this is a really tough question that I think I would put on Prime Minister Carney's voicemail. That's a fundamental question of does Canada want to be closer to the United States or more distant to the United States? And this is, I think, the fundamental question. I don't think that we can affect the long-term equilibrium in terms of general trade flows. I think gravity is just way too powerful. But there might be some space for thinking about redundancies in terms of critical goods, like defense spending or pharmaceuticals, and that's back to the questions of are certain goods special in some sense. But I don't think there's any world in which Canada can just pivot away, kind of like how China has been trying to do over the past 10 years.
I'll just say, and I'm going to go against the grain here a little bit, and this maybe speaks a little bit more to the medium run than the long run, but there's a world in which Canada's geographic proximity and historic supply chain integration with the US actually works in its favor, in the sense that, say these tariffs stick around for a couple of years. 10% tariffs all around the world, high tariffs still on China. Yes, there's still going to be some tariffs on Canada, but proximity matters. Transportation costs matter. Canada is, in that world, actually fairly well positioned to supply the US market. And actually, you can see, I see a world in which there's, to some degree, American buyers reallocate more towards Canada and away from the rest of the world as the rest of the world gets relatively more expensive for Americans. I mean, this is something that has come out in my modeling of this scenario. So again, I'll echo Peter's point and say, look, our relationship with the United States is something that we can't change the geography. We need to exploit it and do the best that we can with that. The only other thing I'll say is, people, and this is something that many people in this room have heard about, in the past couple of months, there's this ongoing discussion about, within Canada trade barriers, the non-tariff trade barriers between provinces. There's already been some kind of words bandied about by the various premiers about getting rid of some of these things, completely getting rid of them by the middle of the summer. You know, absolutely that is something that we should aim for doing. You know, Canada itself has a lot of, you know, geographical issues that make getting things from, say, Ontario to Vancouver pretty difficult over land, you know. We've kind of also got to deal with the situation that we've got, but that's absolutely something that we should shoot for. There's a lot of room, you know, there's a lot of productivity gains to be had from really opening up within Canada as well.
So I want to add to that, it's not obvious to me that a lot of the internal trade barriers are actually policy driven. I think Canada, you know, there's the old joke that Canada is closer to the United States than it is to itself. But I think that what Canada should be concentrating on is basic infrastructure and logistics. How can Canada get its goods out of the country without going through the US? How can Canada ship things from Toronto to Vancouver? I'm not convinced that these estimated trade barriers are actually policy trade barriers. So I'm actually quite skeptical of the magnitude of any potential gains from these summertime policy changes. But I do think there is a role for infrastructure investment in terms of how does Canada get goods across the country and out of the country.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure about half the people here are trade economists or researchers and have read the literature. I want to focus on the political science aspect because I don't think any of us are going to, you know, burn our trade books, and you know, those are our comfort blankets, and we rely on those. But it was really good to hear, you know, you guys reinforce it. But we know the story that, you know, Trump had this issue with China. You know, asked his son-in-law to go find an economist out there who could come up with some theory. So we know this is not strategic, right? Like, we don't need to explain an equilibrium model of this. This is gut, you know, Trump's gut. And I see this period as something like the global financial crisis for macroeconomists, open economy macroeconomists, who are like, our models can't explain this interaction between the financial system and the real economy. I want to understand what political scientists are doing now with their models in light of Trump, you know, with this, like, how do you explain this? You know, in a rational expectations or an equilibrium model, like how you know, what are you doing in terms of your research right now on the political science side to explain how this makes sense in any world? Are you getting my point? Like,
yeah. So I think so if it is like you describe, you know, sends a son-in-law to deal with things, then maybe we should, you know, look at criminology and mob rule rather than political science to analyze that. But I think the question is really, you know, how did, you know, some people claim to be surprised by what this administration is doing, right? A good idea generally is when people tell you what they're going to do, and when people tell you who they are, just believe them, okay? And you know, don't think of that they might be hiding this or being strategic. So this shouldn't have come as a surprise. Trump is doing exactly what he announced before the election. All right. The question for political scientists is, why did he get elected? Right? Why did he get elected? And I think that's where we need to dig a little bit deeper into a variety of factors. We've talked about things like deindustrialization and people losing, you know, jobs that they cherished, and all these changes, whether it's driven by trade or by automatization or whatever it is. That clearly was a factor, right? It clearly was a factor, and I think it made a big difference in places like Pennsylvania and the Midwest. And I think that is fairly well known, and I find it striking that the Democrats haven't really managed to, so Biden sort of did the right thing by saying, all right, let's bring these jobs, we can't bring these jobs back, but we can bring new jobs to specific places. So the Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV pickup truck is built in Tennessee. That didn't get any votes for the Democrats, somehow, right? Lots of these other subsidies of the Inflation Reduction Act go to Republican places, didn't yield anything, right? So there's no clear response that would have changed this outcome, and that is somewhat puzzling, right? There's somewhat puzzling, and it's something that political scientists need to engage with. But then there are also many other factors that I think are relatively unrelated to economics. I think immigration had a huge impact on this election, just like immigration has a huge impact on elections in Europe. The Trump administration is doing exactly what they announced they were going to do, right? And while Trump's popularity is falling, there is certainly one group of people that is even more reviled, and that is congressional Democrats. And that's very striking, right? So we don't really see this, oh, well, that was bad, so we're swinging it to the other side. I think that's where the research needs to go, because I think it's not, like if we say, oh, it's the China shock, it's people who've lost their jobs, that's not really digging deep enough, right? That doesn't explain why we have a large proportion of the American population and similarly large proportions in other industrialized democracies who are voting for, who are sort of voting almost with, what Marxists would call a false consciousness, right? This is not going to benefit them economically. This is just, I'm screwed, well, I'm going to screw the other people even worse, right? It's not going to benefit them economically, but they are so angry that they re-elected Trump, right? So that's one part. And then there's sort of people who are we're on the fence, and we need to figure out what was it that turned middle of the road voters to Trump. Because those are the ones who are probably going to, at the midterm elections, say, well, that wasn't a good idea, right? And going to swing back. So I think this is where the research needs to go in political science. Now, economics is kind of an ideological discipline. Political science is also an ideological discipline. Some of these questions cannot be asked in political science, right? Just like, you could never ask the question of, maybe free trade is nonsense in economics.
I don't have a whole lot to say about that, but the only thing I'll say that, to add on a tiny bit to what Mark said is that if you look at the polling in the US right now, as bad as Trump is doing on economic issues, he's right, Mark's right, he's still, people still view him more favorably on immigration than on any other issue, but the Democrats still poll even worse than Trump, much worse. And so I think part of the question that has to be asked is not just what, pulled voters towards Trump away from the Democrats, but what pushed certain groups of people away from the Democrats towards anyone, and that happened to be Trump.
Not to talk about history, but I'll just say that in periods of super high inequality, high immigration, and animosity toward immigration, and high returns to skill, right? A lot of what we face now, we faced 100 years ago, and in these kinds of periods where the perception is that there isn't a lot of access to opportunity, to better jobs, to just more, when you feel locked out of more, populations turn to these kind of populist candidates, even if there isn't necessarily guarantees that it will help. It's at least a no answer to Democrats whose policies didn't provide the perception of improvement and more opportunity.
Bravo for a singularly stimulating series of remarks and discussion. This is not being listened to in the White House, and the American electorate is obviously not attuned to the sophistication of many of the arguments here. So my first question is, what can we as an economics profession do to somehow fill that gap? And the second question is, how big is this seismic change? Is this the end for a foreseeable future of U.S. hegemony, and with that multilateralism? Are we going into sort of bipolar worlds where there'll be a realm of Chinese influence, and then maybe the EU and the United States and so on? So those are my two questions.
Just to the first, I think these are great questions. Just to the first, in terms of what economists can do, I mean, there is a very anti-elitist sentiment, and economists are sort of, unfortunately, PhD economists can be lumped in with that elite. And so, in some sense, one could argue that there's the way that elections have gone is kind of, people are sort of, maybe there's a return to laying low a little bit, or to choosing words wisely. I think it is but I think it's a really important issue in how we communicate and in our use of jargon and the accessibility of not just our words, but also our work and our writing.
Sort of echoing the same thoughts, I think we need to get out of our towers and expose ourselves to people who so that we, outside our profession, so that we can understand what people really care about. In the past couple months, I've actually spent far more time reading mainstream journalists than I did before. And I think, I would say get your subscription to the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times. They have great journalists who actually really bridge the gap between our expertise as it is and what people really care about. And I think, for me personally, that's really steered me more towards, okay, what's really important? And just regular interactions with anyone who has feet on the ground, I think, is really important.
That'll only cost you about $1,500 combined in subscriptions, but yeah, I think the danger is that there's free news on the internet that are kind of contradicting the enlightened journalism.
What was the second question?
The future of multilateralism, WTO. Is this a temporary shock, or is this going to have long hysteresis effects?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to have very persistent effects. I think it is, again, I think I'm hopeful that there's a world in which the tariffs themselves are not in place 2 years from now. There's a lot of paths for that to happen. But I think rebuilding number one, the credibility of the United States as a reliable, trade partner, and as number two, the kind of the ability of these multilateral organizations like the WTO to actually be effective in terms of getting countries' difficulties addressed. This is going to be something that we're going to be working on for decades, I would imagine. To be quite honest, I could be wrong, but again, that's the thing that keeps me up at night more than anything.
Is this all good? Yeah. We have to accept that we live in a world of absurdity now, and that's probably the politest word anyone could use to describe Trump. Absurd. But we have to ask ourselves, what could actually happen for him to listen to economists? I mean, he idolizes McKinley, but I mean, he doesn't even listen to what McKinley said himself later about tariffs later in life. He's either that or he's blissfully unaware of it. So what could possibly happen for him to then listen to people like yourselves?
Maybe he doesn't need to listen to economists. Maybe he just needs to start listening to lobbyists. Because that's those tend to be, highly motivated, well paid to do just that, right? Talk to politicians. And I think there's if there is hope, strangely enough, that lobbyists will actually rein in some of the worst impulses of this US administration, because it hurts American industry, right? So we can already see that probably one of the reasons why we don't have tariffs on USMCA compliant products is because manufacturing is so integrated, and because lobbyists have told the US government and the US and President Trump that this hurts American companies, right? So at minimum, we need to get sort of, kick this 5 years down the road until we can adjust or something like that. I think that is probably the better scenario, the more optimistic scenario, because there's no shortage of American economists who would be happy to advise the Trump administration. Right?
I'll just, to be a little bit more pessimistic about that, I think the lobbying issue highlights really one of the problems with this type of policy paradigm or regime, I guess I'll call it, in that, yes, we're seeing carve-outs and exemptions already for big businesses, big incumbent established businesses, automakers, Walmart, Amazon, they have the ear of the president. But the reality is that there's, a vast majority of, small businesses around the U.S. have no hope of really getting the ear of the administration. Tariffs on toys from China, they're not going away. Small retailers that, sell those types of things. I mean, I think there have been a lot of articles about, strollers and, things like that for babies, and these things are, doubling in price. The people that make and sell these things, I don't know that they have, they may not have this same ability. And it creates, a lot of inefficiencies in the economy. It really creates a system of misallocation of resources, barriers to entry, protection for established businesses. It's not a good regime to be in. It's a partial fix. But it doesn't get us all the way back.
So maybe I will end with a more optimistic. Well, he responds to bond markets. We've seen that, and the fear that the U.S. dollar may lose this very special place, this very special role that it has, which has brings tremendous benefits to the United States, which typically people speak to this as the exorbitant privilege of the United States from being the issuer of the reserve currency of the world. And for the US dollar to maintain that role, credibility of US policy, US macro policy is fundamental. And so I think that hopefully, on an optimistic note, that the jitteries that we have seen from the uncertainty and the trade and the policies that are being followed, starting to have an impact on bond markets, and how the Trump administration retreated after that, is hopefully a source of optimism. We hope.
Very good. That was excellent. Good job keeping the conversation accessible, dynamic. It was very interesting. Thanks everyone for coming, and please join me in thanking you.